Muy buenos días a todos y a todas. Antes de dar inicio, corroborar si la maestra Dulce María Mejía.
Welcome all. First, we want to know whether Dulce Maria is connected.
Licenciado Serrano, muy buenos días. No, soy Jorge Calcedo, director de medidas de
I'm Jorge, the Director of Protection Measures of the Office for Protection of Children and Adolescents. Unfortunately, Mrs. Dulce had to leave Mexico City, so I am speaking on behalf of the organization. Thank you. We will be starting presently.
Nuevamente, muy buenos días, bienvenidas a la Conferencia Regional sobre Migración. Muchas gracias por
Welcome
unir.
all to the RCM's session on July the 1st at 10:07 Mexico City time. I'm the Executive Secretary of the RCM, and we're going to have the third virtual session on the program of protection for vulnerable migrants and profiles. We are going to have today the session on the protection of vulnerable migrants. Remember, we have simultaneous interpretation, so please close your mics when you are not using the floor, and that any reproduction or dissemination of this content in part or in whole, live or recorded, is prohibited by any means. So any request for reproduction must be processed through the Executive Secretariat. So to start today, we are going to give the floor to Mr. Salcedo Flores, Director of Protective Measures for the Office for the Development of Family. Mr. Salcedo, you have the floor. Morning, how are you? It's a pleasure to greet you today. We are at your disposal. Just to tell you about what the Mexican government's been doing to assist children and adolescents within the context of migration. We had a recent reform regarding protection to children within the context of migration, and it became enforceable this year. And this means that children cannot be detained in migration stations. We don't have them for children and adolescents anymore. That is very important because we see a transition to migration that guarantees rights. And what the law establishes in these reforms is that children have to be immediately referred to any assistance center through federal agencies. You know, each state has an Office for the Protection of Children and a DIB system. So this is what we have to do as the Office for Protection. And we are really starting this quite quickly because we did not have all the assistance centers ready for the referral of these children. So we had to rush that. And this has improved the migration context in which we are. And The reform also indicates that children will be protected from any resolution or determination on their future that does not take into account the best interest of the child. That has to be determined by the offices or instances of protection. This is what we have, what we've been working with. And now, as you know, this is a big progress, big advance, especially taking into account the best interest of the child and working through the RCM. And this will serve us as essential tool for the personnel in these protection offices and with whom we will be able to use more tools to be able to
El Estado
determine
mexicano
more
dentro de las
broadly the
procuradurías de
best interest of the child.
con estos
The
instrumentos
Mexican government has these binding instruments which are already in the general law on the rights of children and adolescents. And also this also includes protection measures that will allow us to link public and private institutions so they can restore any rights of the children that have been violated or identified as such. So this is a topic that undoubtedly important, although was already recognized in the law on the rights of children, it is now regulated. So we cannot have a refoulement of the children also without a determination being made of the best interest of the child, also taking into account the UN Convention on the Rights of Children. So this is what we have been able to do under these reforms to the law.
Muchas gracias, Maestro
Please let me
Salcedo.
know if you have any doubts or questions. Well, thank you. We will have a Q&A session later on, and we will make comments. So you are invited to participate, especially after the presentations by Iowa. Thank you. Now we are going to continue with the context and with what we started in June 18. We are going to go with Gustavo Fernandez. He is the work coordinator
Gustavo
on
es director de
irregular
investigación para
and mass migration, director of research for public policy of the unit of migration policies, registration and identity of people of the Secretary of the Interior of Mexico. So Gustavo, you have the floor. And well, once again, welcome. I would like to thank everybody and Dr. Salcedo for his presence and for giving continuity to this and to this course, and to mention that this activity was conceived as 4 sessions. The first one was on June 18th when we presented this program, this course on protection and assistance to vulnerable migrants. And we are going to have until tomorrow at the M campus a course in protection based on the knowledge and experience of OEM in the matter. So if you have been taking the course, this is a very friendly course. And of course, we are going to exhort you to continue with the course. And today's session is going to provide some feedback on assistance and protection. And tomorrow is going to be very important for this training program. from this irregular mass migration working group. This is going to be very interesting and important, not only because the Mexican PPT, uh, but this triage that we've had between the previous pro tempore uh, presidency and the present one and the future one, the troika as we call it. And tomorrow we are going to provide a proposal for the update of regional guidelines that are from 2013. So we can send them for regional consultation. And we think that this is a very important document. It's been worked on in the RCM. And we hope that all public servants or working with them that take it into consideration, especially the ones with first line service, and use that as their instrument to work and assist and migrants. So we've had 4 activities, 3 sessions, 18 today, tomorrow, and then the course. And we expect participation and questions, and that all of those here have an active participation. I think that we have the expert people from the IOM, and we want to reiterate the importance that all officers and the personnel of the institutions be present with us so we can, together with Government of Costa Rica, the previous PBT, this week, this PBT, and the next one to present the proposal. So once again, I would like to thank everybody who's here and that who have taken the course. Thank you, Gustavo, and thank you to everybody with us today, and especially IOM. Many of you know Rosalind Borland, Senior Specialist in Protection Assistance to Migrants of the Regional IOM Office for North America, Central America, and the Caribbean. Together with Ana Catalina Pical from the same unit, they will be presenting or moderating today's sessions on protection and assistance to uh, persons vulnerable to violence, exploitation, and abuse. So, Rose, you have the floor. We know we're going to be in very good hands with you, especially as a complement to the virtual course that has been taken from the eCampus. Uh, Thank you, and morning. And also thank you for orienting us with the course that we've had. Also congratulate the working group for bringing protection to the forefront of the discussion, since it's very important. Also, Dr. Salcedo, thank you for giving us a very concrete example of what we are discussing today. This topic of unaccompanied minors, separated minors, and how to safeguard their rights. So this is going to be a very interesting session today, and I'm going to ask my colleague Ana Catalina to introduce herself, and then we'll start with the presentation. Morning. I hope everybody is doing great. Pleasure to be with you today again in these learning spaces. I'm Catalina Picado. I work with her in protection and assistance to vulnerable migrants. And we hope that the content that we have with for today's sessions can be explored together. Thank you. And thank you. Let's start. And today's session has the purpose of I think about 40 some people connect. So we would like to participate freely. Ask for the floor, raise your hands, and we also have activities so we can have an interactive session. We are going to share information that will be complementary to the course that you have taken or have started, and we hope it is also complementary or supplementary information for the process of the proposal. Again, I'm the regional specialist of the IOM, and today we are going to give you some best practices and models that we've had globally in the region on the protection and assistance to migrants vulnerable to exploitation, violence, or abuse. And I'm going to give the floor to Catalina. I am going to give the floor to her now. So this is going to be an icebreaker activity to try to promote participation and to continue working with more. So what we are going to ask you kindly is to activate the annotate tool in Zoom. You're going to see it either on the green bar above. You are going to be seeing Catalina's screen, and then you are going to say view options. You click on it, and then you have an annotate function. And we are going to click on it, and we're going to have another little bar. And the new bar, just click on text. And it's going to open a text box where you will be able to write. Here it is. So please try, put just your name. You don't need the surname right now. And answer the following questions. First of all, it's, do you live in the same country in which you were born? Have you ever traveled outside your country of birth? Or if you have any close or people close to you, relatives, friends that have immigrated. Say, try to use the columns.
Ok, vemos que muchas personas han salido de su
So we've seen that a lot of people have left their country of birth and that they know people close to them that have migrated. My whole family has migrated and my children were born in other countries. Many still reside in the country in which they were born. Excellent. Thank you for their participation. And the idea is to know about names and experiences with migration in a more intimate, more or closer manner. This will allow us to be more sensitive. And these are topics that are more important and regarding which we can have a more personal experience, in this case with migration. So now we will go with Rose.
Muchas gracias.
No, y ahí
And thank you. I want to highlight what Catalina said, that our focus in at the IOM for migration is rather holistic. Yeah, it can be within the country, outside the country, internationally speaking. So it is a broad definition. So many people fall in that definition. So we are going to start with some of the principles regarding human rights, and we are going to tie this for some commitments that we have, and just to have a few topics highlighted. Then we are going to share with you the model we have the IOM to determine the vulnerability of a migrant, who are vulnerable, who are not vulnerable. And then we are going to close with some examples of guidelines that we have. Regarding the order of this session, I'm going to start with some content, and but the idea is to have an interactive moment. So in addition to any doubt or question that you may have, you can always raise your hand and use the chat at all times. So you don't hear a presentation all the time. And then we are going to have a moment after the reflections from our experts. We are going to have a space for Q&A. Next one, please. So we will start with this framework of human rights and principles that we want to highlight related to the protection of vulnerable migrants. So Catalina, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, Rose. Bueno, en esta oportunidad los vamos a invitar y las vamos a
Now
invitar
we
a
are
analizar
going
con
to
ustedes
ask
para
you
las
to
siguientes
reflect
preguntas que
a
van a estar
bit
apareciendo en pantalla.
about the following questions.
La primera pregunta que tenemos es ¿por qué
The first one would be,
deberíamos
why do
contribuir
we
a la
have to
protección de las
contribute to
personas migrantes?
safeguard the rights of
Les
migrants?
agradeceríamos si alguno o alguna quiere tomar la palabra
So if anybody wants
para
to
iniciar las
take
sesiones.
the floor or
¿Por
write
qué deberíamos
your
contribuir a
thoughts in
resguardar
the
los
chat.
derechos de las
So
personas
why
migrantes?
should we contribute to safeguard the rights of migrants? I'm also monitoring if anybody wants to speak. Just raise your hand or request the floor. So you can use the chat or the microphone. Gustavo, please.
Hola, pues me parece que la idea puede parecer bastante sencilla, pero
The
debemos...
idea may be simple, but the rights of migrants should be safeguarded just because they're human beings. There shouldn't be any other consideration. They're human beings. They have rights. They should be protected. There can be other considerations, but I would say that that is the basic one. It's simple.
Exactamente, Gustavo. Es un buen
Exactly,
punto.
Gustavo.
Mira, todos
It is a
somos
very
seres
good
humanos
point.
y todos
We
merecemos
are human
la
beings.
protección
Humans
y
have
también
human
el
rights.
resguardar
They
nuestra
should be
dignidad como
protected.
personas.
And our dignity as people should
¿Alguna
also
otra
be
persona que
safeguarded.
quiera participar?
Any other person would like to participate? I think somebody, morning, as our colleague said, uh, yeah, they should be respected because we are human beings. But from a more legalistic point of view, because of international law, that gives us a tool to make it mandatory. Because that sometimes you have to do it in this way. Also thinking about it as human beings, we never know whether we will be migrants in future. Maybe a big natural disaster, a conflict, or something that forces us to leave. the time will change. So if we have a regional position of solidarity, we would have a context of help. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a usted, Kixman. Y sí,
Thank
efectivamente,
you very
además de sermos
much.
personas, también
In
participamos
addition to
por
being
leyes
people,
internacionales.
we
Y
have an
estas
international legal
están con normas
framework
de aplicación obligatoria, que
with
son normas que son
norms of
más
mandatory
restrictivas y
application
internacionales, ¿verdad? Que
and
son
others that are
basadas
more
en
international
podríamos
commitments,
decirle desde la perspectiva legal, ¿verdad? Y todos
and
estos
that some of
ayudan e
them
impulsan que
are
los estados
legally
tomen medidas
binding.
en favor de
So
la
this
protección de los
means that
derechos de las
states
personas
are going
migrantes
to
y
take
no migrantes, ¿verdad?
measures to protect the
Le agradezco
rights
mucho su
of
intervención, Kixman.
people,
¿Otra
migrants,
pregunta de la
and
otra persona?
non-migrants
Hay algunos
alike. We
comentarios en el
have
chat que
several
reflejan
comments
lo
in the
ya
chat
dicho, de que somos humanos, de
reflecting
que seres
what
humanos
has been
tenemos todos
said,
los derechos,
that all
de
human rights
que
are subject or
nuestros
holders
comentarios,
of
como ya
rights,
vimos, nadie está aislado de
and
migrar,
nobody
y las
is
personas
isolated
que les
or
tocó
protected
migrar no les ha quitado
from
sus
having to
derechos.
migrate.
Y un comentario en
And
línea
a
con lo que
comment
decía Catalina, que todos
aligned
tenemos
to what
alguna
Catalina said,
responsabilidad de
everybody
contribuir a los
has
derechos
the
humanos y a
responsibility
promocionar
of
sus derechos
contributing
y
to
hacer
human
realidad algunos de
rights,
los marcos
and
internacionales.
this refers to some of the international
Sí, y siguen
tools
participando en el chat, pero
or laws. So
hay
we
una
still
mano
have it in the
encima de
chat.
Rubén.
We have a hand
Sí,
from
buenos días.
Ruben,
Bueno, también
and
solamente agregar lo que
we
han
also
comentado.
just to tell you,
Es importante también porque su
it is
condición
very
de migrantes
important
exacerba
because their
la
condition
migración.
of
Entonces,
as migrants
es
will
importante
exacerbate the
contribuir para
vulnerability,
que se reconozcan
and
los derechos
we
de las
need the
personas
rights to be
de mayor
safeguarded
vulnerabilidad.
within this context of greater vulnerability to them.
Muchas gracias, Rubén. Sí, efectivamente,
And
ciertas condiciones en la
there
migración
are certain
incrementan la
conditions in
vulnerabilidad de algunas
migration
personas
that
y por eso
increase
se
the
requiere
vulnerability of
un
certain
enfoque de
people,
protección, una respuesta
and we need a
específica.
focus
Muchas
of
gracias, Rubén, por
protection.
la intervención. Ahora
Thank
queremos
you,
llegar
Ruben,
a otra
for
otra
your
pregunta.
intervention. We have
¿Cuáles son
another one.
estos derechos?
What are
Y
these
voy a agregarles
rights?
otra nube
And I'm going to add you another one,
con otra pregunta que sería,
another
¿cambian estos
question.
derechos según su perfil?
Do your rights change according to your
Y
profile?
luego de
Yes
esto
or
regresamos al
no?
micrófono y el chat
And
para
I'm going
escuchar sus
to
opciones. Muchas
give
gracias.
you the chat there to record your impressions. So please let us know.
Estoy monitoreando por
I'm
manito.
monitoring.
Sí, hay comentarios en el
We
chat.
have comments
Entonces
in the
tenemos
chat.
salud,
We
educación,
have
seguridad,
education,
libertad, no discriminación,
healthcare,
vida,
non-discrimination,
igualdad, la
equality, right
obligación de
to
la vida
life,
y el
the
Estado
obligation of
de
life, and the
garantizar los derechos de las
state's
personas migrantes.
obligation to
Y el
basically
turno es
safeguard
Fidelina.
the rights
Adelante,
of
adelante.
human beings. And then we
Sí,
have
buenos días
Fidelina,
a todos todos.
and
Efectivamente, los
morning,
derechos no
or
cambian en ningún país,
effectively,
están inherentes a las
rights don't
personas
change
y el
anywhere.
Estado nos
They're
obliga
inherent of the
por ley,
people,
por derechos,
and the states
de dar
must
cumplimiento de ellos,
safeguard.
estén de tránsito, estén
It
irregulares
doesn't
o
matter whether in
irregulares.
transit or irregular
Entonces, no van
situation.
a variar.
The rights belong to the person. That will not
Excelente
change.
intervención. Muchas gracias, Fidelina.
Excellent
Y muchas gracias a todos y
intervention.
a todas aquellas que están
And
escribiendo en
thank
el
you
chat sus
all
respuestas. Son muy
for
valiosas.
those of
Y
you who
antes
are
de ir a la
writing
última
your
pregunta del turno,
answers.
para cerrar este espacio de
And
reflexión,
to close
queremos
this
ver
space
cómo
for
se
reflection
ejercen estos derechos. Hay
is
algunos
the
comentarios
legal
basados en lo
space
que
where
hemos
we
visto
have the
anteriormente en las
rights.
intervenciones, tanto en el chat
And
como
we've seen
cuando
some
tomas el
interventions
micrófono. Entonces,
in the chat or when
quisiéramos
you took
clarificar
the
bajo
microphone.
qué marco jurídico creen
And
ustedes
we
que se
need to
encuentran
know
estos derechos en
in
los tiempos
which
pasados.
legal framework these
Y
rights
tenemos la
are
mano
located.
del doctor Salcedo.
Right now, we
Si
have the hand of
ya
Dr.
tiene
Salcedo.
o si quiere tomar la micrófono.
Hola.
So,
Bueno,
Dr.
mi pregunta
Salcedo,
era sobre la
well,
pregunta de
really,
cuáles son
it
los
was on the
derechos que
previous
podrían ser
questions
protegidos
regarding the rights,
según
which
como lo
are
establece la
all
propia Constitución Federal, la
as
Constitución
established by the
mexicana,
Federal
para
Constitution
garantizar
of the
la
Mexican
universalidad,
state,
indivisibilidad
we're talking about universality and divisibility of the rights, and whether they are in the regulations or not, human rights have to be respected, all of them. Being migrants just a characteristic of a human being, but human beings and human rights are all the rights that have to be respected. And we have to emphasize that not only those that are in the laws or the regulations. And related to the legal framework in the Constitution of Mexico, we already find the obligations and the rights people have for merely being people. Now, going for specific aspects, whether we have children who have special procedures to safeguard the rights in the laws on the protection of the rights of children, and we have, for example, law on refugees and asylum seekers, and then we have international convention on the rights of the child, and so we have a very broad
Sí,
regulatory
efectivamente, tenemos
framework.
muchos marcos normativos
We
que
have several
protegen y
regulatory
deben velar
frameworks
por el cumplimiento de
that
estos derechos,
safeguard
tanto a nivel nacional
and
como a nivel
enforce
internacional.
these rights, both at
Muchísimas
the
gracias.
national and
Rose,
international
¿alguna
level.
otra manita o ningún otro
Rose,
comentario?
any other
Si no,
hand or
podríamos
comment?
continuar con la
If
presentación.
not, we can continue with the presentation.
Sí, muchas gracias. Y
Thank you very much.
agradezco en particular
I really
esta
think
oportunidad de
and
diferentes
thank
profesiones,
everybody
porque por un
for
lado tenemos
the
a las
question on the
personas
different
con
profiles,
derechos humanos,
because
no
we
importa
are recognizing that everybody has
estas
human rights,
personas podemos
but
tener
certain
otras
people
obligaciones de
may
riesgo
need
por ser
other
ciudadanos
types
también
of assistance,
adolescentes,
so
¿verdad?
we may
Y
have
así es también con
other
los niños.
obligations
Entonces es
with
a trick
them.
question.
So
Seguimos,
it's a trick question.
por favor.
So let's continue.
Entonces, el anterior era para
The previous
refrescar,
one
tal vez
was
es muy
to do as a
pequeño,
refresher,
para recordar los derechos
but
que todos tenemos
to
y que siempre hay que tener un enfoque en base a
remind
estos
ourselves of the
derechos
rights that we
cuando
have,
estamos trabajando con todas personas y
especially when we're
especialmente porque
talking
somos
about
migrantes.
people, and we're
Y
talking about
independientemente
rights when working with
de
migrants.
su
And
nacionalidad,
this is
estatus
regardless of
migratoria y sin
nationality,
discriminación, por
migration
supuesto.
status, and of course
Esto
without
de acuerdo a
discrimination.
todo el
And
marco normativo
this
internacional,
to
nacional y regional que estábamos hablando.
basically
Algunos
respect the
derechos
international
repasábamos
legal
algunos
framework.
ejemplos.
And we
Está el
have
derecho
the
de
right
salir de su país,
to
el
leave
derecho
your
a
country
solicitar
and return
asilo,
to it,
el principio de la no
to
devolución,
seek
el
asylum
derecho al respeto de la vida
non-refoulement,
privada y
uh,
familiar,
the right
el
to
derecho
private
a
family
recibir atención
life,
médica y social,
having
los derechos de
medical
niños y
social
adolescentes y
assistance,
el principio de
and the
igualdad
rights
de
to adolescents
estábamos
and the
hablando
best interest
anteriormente
of
en
the
la
child
comisión.
that we were talking about before.
También importante
And
reconocer que en la
also
región hay un amplio
that
marco
the region
normativo también muy
has a
importante.
broad regulatory
Aquí
framework
destacan desde la CIDH
that
algunos principios muy
from
importantes como la igualdad de trato
Inter-American
y la no discriminación. Y
Human
hay el
Rights Court,
asterisco es
and
porque
that is why we have
el
this
hecho de que hay
asterisk,
una igualdad de trato
because
que
we
hay la
have
necesidad de determinar las
equal
necesidades específicas de la
treatment
persona en base de
does not
sus
mean we're not going to
expectativas.
take into account
Entonces,
specific
déjame mencionar
aspects of the
eso.
person,
Siempre la aplicación de la
and
protección
also
diferenciada,
to apply
individualizada,
differentiated protection,
con una
individualized
perspectiva
protection,
de derechos humanos,
with the
de género,
perspective of
por
human rights, of
identidad,
gender,
por edad, etcétera.
age,
Y porque estamos hablando de personas
and
migrantes,
because we're
va a ser
talking about
necesario
migrants,
cooperación más que nunca
we
entre
need
países
cooperation
y
more
esta
than ever
responsabilidad
with countries,
compartido
between countries, and
dentro de
this
cada
shared
país
responsibility
para, por ejemplo,
between
proteger a
the
un menor
states
en proceso
to
de
protect, for example, a
repatriación en
minor
un país
that
y
is
luego
undergoing assisted protection
protegido a su país de origen
and
y así
protected return, for
sucesivamente en cada uno de
example,
los dos estados.
to their country.
También la importancia
And
de seguir
also the
luchando
importance to
contra
keep
la discriminación, la
fighting
xenofobia y la
discrimination,
intolerancia constitucional
xenophobia,
que
and
han,
other
por
types
ejemplo,
of discrimination
exacerbado por
that
situaciones como la
can be
pandemia actual.
exacerbated by
Y
situations such as
importante
the
reconocer
current
que los
pandemic,
migrantes están
and the
contribuyendo
importance
a
of
una
recognizing
serie
that
de
migrants
comunidades
are contributing to their families, communities, especially transit and destination communities. So today's session regarding this protection of migrants, and we're going to start with the understanding that there are certain people and populations that are exposed to particular risks which can cause an increase in their vulnerability. And that is want to talk about that many migrants that can be more vulnerable than others, and that we can analyze that to handle our answers. Some examples that may come to mind, for example, unaccompanied minors. We can have people with medical needs that live with chronic conditions, refugees, asylum seekers, gender diversity or sexual orientations, migrants that don't have documentation. So we have a lot of people that have to be considered in that regard. Also, reinforce the aspect that migration is a right. And when we're talking about something that's more realistic, we can recognize there are migrations that are positive, that can provide a lot of aspects or benefits to migrants, but others can have a lot of risk and a negative impact. But we start with this being a right, and the right to live and to be in their own country. That migration is not only the movement per se, but the process of migration, transit, and what you see, and your return. Even this is part of your rights as a person. And we're talking about different migrations. If that can be, for example, forced or voluntary, among others. Also want to highlight the importance of exercising your rights. If you cannot basically demand your rights be respected, for example, you don't have a legal status or documentation, they have a lot of barriers to access social services or legal recourse. And although we have a lot of complexity for the application, somebody who has an irregular status still means that they have um, a responsibility. And we are not going to go into the other frameworks. Of course, we have a great variety of legal instruments and regional and even national that are for the protection of these rights. We are going to have another activity. So I'm going to give the floor once again to Catalina.
Muchas gracias, Rose. En esta
Thank you,
ocasión tenemos
Rose.
otra
In
actividad
this
tratando
case,
justo de la
we
ley
are
de la
going to have
De
another
nuevo, vamos a ir a la
the annotation with Zoom.
de visualizar
So
y vamos a
we
usar
are
esta
going to
herramienta.
visualize,
Pero esta
annotate,
pizarrita
and this
vamos a
time
seleccionar la que dice
we
stamps
are
o
going
sellos.
to select
En estos sellos que
stamps.
tenemos
These
en esta
stamps that we have
función de la herramienta
in
annotate
this
son los que tenemos por
function
acá.
in
Está
annotate
la
is
X,
the
la
one that we see
estrellita, el corazón,
here,
el check
the
y
check
los
and the
flechitas.
heart, and
Entonces,
even
en la
a
siguiente,
little arrow.
en la siguiente
So
Es
the
donde vamos a
next
poner el sello. Y la pregunta para poner el sello es,
screen
¿conocen
is
algún otro instrumento
for
técnico o marco estratégico
the
relacionado con
different
la protección de las personas
seal. Do
migrantes
you
vulnerables?
know anything
Muchas
else
gracias. Veo que
for the
Glenda,
protection
Jorge,
of vulnerable
Jesús,
people? Glenda,
Rosy,
Jorge, Jesus, and
Juan,
Rosalind,
Dalia, Luis Alonso.
Juan, and
Estamos
Delia, and Luis
listos. Muchas
Alonso are
gracias.
putting the little seals.
Excelente, muchas gracias.
So we have that. Excellent. Thank you very much.
Bueno, nos alegra mucho que todos, de manera casi que
We
unánime,
really
nos han dicho que sí
think
conocen
that
algunos instrumentos
everybody
o marcos estratégicos.
know more
Excelente.
instruments or strategic
Ok,
frameworks.
entonces esto nos da pie
So
para
this gives
continuar con la
us
presentación.
the
Vamos a
opportunity
ver
to
algunos otros
continue
marcos
with the
estratégicos
presentation. We're going to
que
see
son relevantes
some
para el
other
tema.
strategic
Entonces, sin
frameworks
más, le
that
cedo
are
la
relevant
palabra
for this topic.
para continuar con
And
la
now
presentación.
we're going
Muchas
to
gracias.
give the floor again to Rose.
Rose, tu micrófono.
Yes, I'm so sorry, perdón. Ando sola. Muchísimas gracias, Luis Alonso. Iba a decir que antes de seguir,
Thank you. I was going to say it would be very interesting to see if anybody wants to share the instrument you had. You can have it in the chat, and you can feel free for that. There are many examples if anybody would like to take the floor regarding that. The Global Compact for Migration, okay, that would be one. What other would it be? My part was thinking the Transnational Convention of Transnational Crime and traffic also, that has protocols for assistance for victims of trafficking or smuggling. Anybody else? Any other comments? I mean, conventions on the elimination of all forms of social discrimination, SICA, MERPS, that deals with refugees, excellent, and the whole aspect of violence against women, which is very important, and people with disabilities, and Cartagena Consensus of Montevideo, conventions of the status of stateless people. And one of the most important topics is that it's not the framework of human rights that applies, that we have international law on migration, maritime, and others that can also give us protection elements and the assistance elements. So we're talking about that regarding the framework of human rights and rights in general, to basically expand a bit what we're talking about. And thank you for the elements. So, and now these are topics that are part of the commitments in the Agenda 2030. We have a migration, and the more specific one is 10.7, which is quite holistic, facilitating regular and safe migration. And we can have objective 8, where we have human trafficking and decent work, or 25, gender-based violence. So we have several spaces that are also applied to protection and assistance to migrant, and it's part of the global agenda. And we can also go with the Global Compact on Migration and also MERPS. And we have many that are related with protection and assistance from reducing vulnerability and reinforcing international cooperation, facilitate return in decent, safe conditions, improve consular protection. So it is in almost all the objectives, and we are going to share the presentation with you if you want to look at it in more detail later on. Now, we are going to go with the frameworks, national, internationals, and the models. We will start with walking a few steps on the shoes of a migrant, the reasons why they would be leaving home within current context such as the pandemic. We know that negative reasons, but in this case, we can have these reasons. For example, you lack livelihood, and we have an impact, very important impact in these negative factors. So let's start thinking about migration. Right now, we are going to have this game with the methodology, and then we are going to give this. And now we are going to play with another application. It's called Mentimeter. All of you that have the possibility of putting Google Explorer or any other in, go with menti.com, and when you see that, it's going to send you to this particular screen,
Que vamos a usar para
and
esta
it's going to ask you for a code.
67663857.
And you see it there, 67663857. We are
En la
going to
barra de
go
búsqueda menti.com
to our browser. We're going to go to menti.com, and this is going to send you to the Mentimeter page, and we can input a code,
en la siguiente pantalla.
and we're going to have the activity in the next page.
Y el código.
We also have the menti.com and the code.
Aquí tienen la actividad. Y al
Here you
final
have the activity,
espero que sí lo puedan ver, se mantiene el código para quienes no lo pudieron tomar o no lo pueden ver en el
and
chat,
then if
pues más
you
arriba
cannot see it in the
aparece el
chat,
código. Y la
here
dirección
you
final,
have
que es
the
menti.com.
code and the direction.
Entonces, acá
Right
tenemos la
now,
siguiente pregunta. ¿Por
we
qué
have the
las personas,
following question.
y la tenemos en
Why
español y
do
en inglés,
people
los dos idiomas
migrate?
que hablan inglés y que están en esta reunión?
So
Pueden
you see it in
leerlas. Les agradecería
English
también en
and in
Spanish,
Spanish, and
los países
please
en su idioma.
put your
Y esta nube de palabras lo que va a hacer
thoughts.
es que va a tomar las palabras
And
que nos
here,
interesan, que son
what
más
we are going to
palabras por
see
persona,
is that the
y las
different
irán agregando
words
conforme van
for people,
ingresando. Entonces vamos a ver
and we are
cosas en
going
la
to
siguiente
see
pantalla.
excellent,
Vamos a
as you can see
funcionar
in the
cada vez que
screen,
nos han ingresado en la aplicación.
that here we have the different words that you have
Parece
entered
que
on the
cambiaron
screen,
pequeñas frases
and you
para
can put some other, for example, small phrases or
Excelente, muchas gracias.
excellent.
Tenemos
Thank you
frases
very
de
much.
cómo huir de la violencia, cambio
And
climático, amenazas
climate
de seguridad,
change,
pobreza, violencia
fleeing
institucional,
violence,
oportunidades,
poverty,
bienestar,
generalized violence,
reunificación familiar,
lack of opportunity,
violencia,
violence,
refugio,
family
situaciones de
reunification,
riesgo, medios de ayuda,
risks,
inseguridad,
livelihood,
falta de empleo,
insecurity,
mejora de
lack of
vida,
employment,
educación, trabajo,
persecution,
para cubrir
work,
sus necesidades, etc.
to have their
Muchas
needs
gracias
met.
por todas estas palabras que han ido
Thank you
escribiendo y vemos que
for
sin
the
duda
different
cada vez más
words being introduced.
Y
We have
tenemos
more
la
words,
de la desigualdad,
and we have inequality,
el intervencionismo,
policy,
los problemas
interventions,
políticos, la salud,
political issues, health,
también tenemos
dreams,
mejores oportunidades, amenazas
better
a la seguridad,
opportunities,
redes familiares,
threats to physical integrity,
razones económicas.
insecurity,
Excelente, muchas gracias.
and yeah.
Efectivamente, estas son unas de las muchas razones por las
And
que
these
las
are
personas
some of the
migran.
many reasons
Y a
why
continuación
people
vamos a empezar
migrate.
con Rose.
And now
Algunas
we
de
are
ellas
going
vamos
to
comenzando.
see them
Les agradecemos
with
mucho su
Rose.
participación en la nube de palabras. Y en la siguiente
And
actividad
thank you
tendremos el link
very
usando
much
menti.com. Entonces,
for
todos
using
tenemos identificación de
menti.com.
aplicación y sabemos cómo
We
llenar el
have
link. Muchas gracias a
the
todos y todas.
application
Muchísimas
identified,
gracias,
so
Catalina, por guiarnos en la
basically,
actividad y excelente ver
and
que 21
here
personas lograron
we can
conectarse.
see that
Para
21
ello,
people were able
este
to
espacio de Menti
connect
es
to
gratuito.
Menti. This is a
También pueden
free
diseñar
space
actividades
if you want to design
y se puede hacer
activities
completamente
and you
gratis.
go to
Ustedes
mentimeter.com
tienen sus propias
and you can have
identificaciones.
your own free account.
Sí, muy destacado.
And I would
eh,
like to
pobreza,
see that
educación,
poverty, family reunification, and violence are three of the main drivers that we can see.
La razón de ese ejercicio es recordar un poco la
And
complejidad
this
de las
exercise
decisiones que
would
motivan
be
la
to see
migración.
the complexity of the
Tiene que ser
decisions
circunstancias personales
that
o sus
deal with
familias,
migration. Can be
condiciones
personal, family
socioeconómicas, puede
considerations,
tener que ver con
socioeconomic
los sueños de
conditions,
uno, las
or your
oportunidades de
own
uno,
dreams,
la situación
seeking
de violencia en
opportunities,
la familia o la comunidad.
whether you have a
También
situation
estas
of
decisiones
violence.
se toman en base
And
a
we
derechos
also have decisions
vinculados a
made
una condición
based
migratoria.
on options,
Hay forma de migrar regularmente
whether
por el
there
trabajo, por
is a
ejemplo,
way
pero
to migrate
si se pierden
regularly
los
or not.
derechos en un
What
país
if we
no
lose the
y ya no
migration
puede
status
migrar de
in a
forma
foreign
legal
country?
o ya no puede
So
trabajar de
you
forma
no
legal,
longer
eso puede
have legal
afectar
status and hence you can no longer work
cambia las políticas y
legally.
las oportunidades de qué opciones hay para aquellas
And
personas que viven
policies
en
and
otras partes de la
opportunities,
región.
for
Eso también
example,
cambia, por supuesto, la
opportunities
planeación y
for
la toma de
people
decisión.
that can
Y
also
estamos
affect
viendo actualmente por
decision
el
making.
impacto de la pandemia que muchos
And due to
migrantes
the impact of the
están
pandemic, we
perdiendo
see
sus
that
medios de
many
vida,
migrants have
volviéndose
lost
a
their
sus países
livelihoods
porque vean más posibilidad
and
y
they
más
return to their
oportunidad en
countries
sus países
because
oportunidades
they
de origen.
see
Entonces hay
that
una
they have a greater
repercusión
chance of
por
survival
las
there.
decisiones que toman en relación a su migración.
So we see the
Actualmente.
decisions based on migration.
Las últimas estadísticas de la
The
Naciones
last
Unidas nos
statistics
muestra que
of the
hay
UN show
21 millones de migrantes
over 221 million migrants
incluidos
around the
migrantes
world.
internacionales, que estamos
That
hablando
means
en
international
las
migrants.
Américas son 73.5
Over
y más
73
de la
million
mitad
in the
son
Americas only,
mujeres o niñas.
and
Entonces
over
ya
half
sabemos
are
que las
female, women
personas
and
migran,
girls.
muchas mujeres migran
So
por
many
formas de
women are
migraciones por varias
leaving
razones, incluyendo
for many
apoyar
reasons,
sus familias.
also to support
Sus hijos.
their families.
Siguiente. Entonces vamos a hacer una breve reflexión y nos
And
pueden
let's go with a brief
opcionalidades
reflection.
escribir la palabra o comentar en chat como se siente que les
Please
gustaría.
let us know
Y pensando en este universo de
regarding
personas
this
migrantes,
universe of millions of
¿quién se
migrants.
encuentra en una situación de vulnerabilidad?
Okay,
Entonces voy
who
a
would be a migrant in a
voy a compartir
situation
unos
of
minutos para
vulnerability?
facilitar
So we're going to try to facilitate this
Entonces
particular
estoy viendo
exercise.
si hay manitos
So I'm
y
looking
cuando
at raised
mencionamos
hands.
vulnerable,
And when we're
¿quién
talking about
piensa
vulnerable migrant,
qué sería un
who
ejemplo de un
do you
migrante
think about?
vulnerable?
What is the image in
Mónica,
your
por
head
favor.
when you talk about vulnerable migrant?
Sí, gracias. Hola.
Monica,
Serían niños, niñas,
for example, children,
adolescentes, sería uno de los
teenagers,
grupos, y
one of the groups,
mujeres embarazadas,
and women,
las
pregnant
personas
women,
mayores también,
the elderly
personas con
as well,
discapacidad.
people with disabilities,
Bueno, dejo la palabra si alguien más quiere.
and
Perfecto. Entonces estamos viendo ya
So we are talking about age, gender, pregnancy, disability. Any other questions? Francisco. To build on what she said, indigenous people, especially vulnerable.
Sí, muchas gracias. Y veo también en el chat otro
And,
personas indígenas, otros
and
étnicos. También
yeah, ethnic groups,
personas que no tienen documentos.
people who have no documents.
Otra persona puso
Another one, but
todos, ya que dejan su país, pueden tener
everyone
vulnerabilidad.
can be vulnerable when you're leaving your country.
Voy a ir más lento para que Catalina está captando por nosotros.
Yeah.
Tenemos,
So
sí, personas indocumentados. Tenemos
undocumented people,
todos migrantes. Es una de las respuestas.
all migrants is
Pueden
one
ser
of the
vulnerables.
answers. They can be vulnerable.
Tenemos otro es personas en condiciones de calle.
Then we have people who have no home, who are on the streets.
También migrantes víctimas de trata o objeto de tráfico.
Victims of felonies or criminal activities like trafficking.
Ujú. También hay personas que desconocen el idioma.
And people who have a language barrier or who are illiterate.
Ujú. Población LGTBI.
LGTBI population.
Ujú. Gracias, Catalina.
Thank you,
Hay alguien
Catalina.
que hace la precisación. Ya tenemos niños, adolescentes, pero
We
pueden ser
have
no
children and
acompañados,
teenagers, and
así
then
que
unaccompanied
muy
in
importante.
particular.
Ujú. Otras personas están resaltando jóvenes,
And we were talking about
con
the
idiomas
young
diferentes,
people, different
con
languages,
necesidades médicas. Un par de personas
and
han
medical
comentado que
conditions.
padecen de alguna patología o que tienen alguna enfermedad crónica. Excelente. Entonces ya estamos viendo una gran
And
lista de
we have a big list
personas migrantes que podrían estar en una
of
situación de vulnerabilidad. Y lo
migrants that can be in a
que
situation of
veo que hay una
vulnerability.
mezcla de
And
factores
we
por
see
edad o por
a mix
identidad,
of
pero
factors
todo
and
es por la
identity
persona y su experiencia
in
específica
people
o
and their
sus
experience
necesidades
or specific
de poder
education.
leer o no, o su
For example,
experiencia
being able to read or
de que
write.
fuera víctima de un crimen o no. Entonces, ya estamos comenzando a ver los diferentes facetas de
And
esos
we see the
factores.
different facets of these
También estoy viendo en
factors.
el chat personas que no cuenten con documentos de
And
identidad o
people with
nacionalidad,
no ID
personas
documents.
varados. Sí, personas varados es un tema muy importante que hemos
And
estado
we see
viendo
a very
en
important
la región.
issue with
Orgullosamente,
experiencing
los
in
países en la región
the region with the pandemic.
logrado ayudar muchas
And the
personas varadas a
countries
regresar a sus países,
have
pero ha
been
sido un
able
esfuerzo
to
muy
help
grande
stranded migrants
que siguen
return.
muchas personas en estas
And
condiciones.
a lot of people,
Creo que
unfortunately, still
podemos
remain in
seguir.
these conditions. So I
Muchísimas
think
gracias por
we can
sus
continue.
ejemplos que nos ayuda a ilustrar un poco este tema de la vulnerabilidad que estamos entrando.
And
Otra es, si comparamos
once
diferentes
again,
personas
if we
migrantes que están en
compare different
situaciones
migrants to understand
en una situación de
who
vulnerabilidad,
may
hay
be in a vulnerable
diferentes
situation, we need to
posiciones o
understand
posiciones
why.
y a
What
qué
places them
están
in
varados,
this
qué
particular
tipo de
situation?
violencia o
What type
explotación
of
o
violence,
abuso o
exploitation, or
problema están
abuse or
enfrentando. Y no
problem
solo
could
de
they
situación de
face?
vulnerabilidad en general.
And not
Entonces
only
vamos
think
a
about
ver
vulnerability
cómo
in
podemos hacer eso.
general. And we can show you what we can do.
Ya, y perdón, y esto lo hacemos
And
específicamente para lograr
this is
entender cómo
specifically
brindarles una respuesta que
to
es
give
basada
you
en sus
or provide you an
necesidades,
answer that is based on
ayudarles
your
con
needs
asistencia
to
y con
provide
lo que saben que
assistance
necesitan.
and
Entonces, otra vez, los
restore
lineamientos
the rights. So the guidelines that we are going to propose, the new version, the model we are sharing, everything has to deal with detecting which migrants need this help and to be able to respond suitably within the context, for example, of a caravan, a border crossing point, or trying to see who of the people would need this tailored assistance.
Ahora vamos en la sesión a entrar un poco en este modelo de cómo identificar la vulnerabilidad de
And
las personas migrantes.
we have to see then how to identify vulnerabilities.
Me gusta comenzar con un ejemplo
And let's start with an
que uso
example.
muchas veces cuando estamos hablando
And we
del tema,
use that many
que es
times.
la mujer migrante. Cuando uno
Migrant
piensa en mujeres
women.
migrantes,
When we're
sabemos
talking
que
about
son personas
migrant women, they are
pero la
vulnerable.
respuesta es un poco más complicada, porque hay que
But
pensar
the
en cada
answer
mujer
is more
migrante
complicated.
y qué le hace vulnerable o no. Entonces, ¿por qué
And what
quiero
makes them
hacer eso?
vulnerable?
Y ahí si gusta puede revelar la parte de abajo, Catalina.
And we can
Si
see
la mujer se
this.
movió por un problema de violencia en
And
su familia
are they moving
o
because of
por una
violence?
oportunidad de estudio, por
Do
ejemplo.
they see an
Yo soy
opportunity,
mujer migrante.
work,
Yo soy
or
de Estados
study?
Unidos. Yo vivo
I
aquí
am
en
from
Costa
the
Rica.
US. I'm a migrant. I live in Costa Rica.
Trabajo.
I migrated
Y
because
la
of a
forma
job
en que yo
opportunity.
migré era
And the
por
way I
mar,
did
por avión,
was
con documentos,
regulated,
además con un
documented,
trabajo, con seguro.
with
Entonces,
a firm
eso
job
para mí
offer
ha
with
sido algo muy
insurance. So
positivo
for me,
y yo he
it has
estado
been
muy protegida.
only positive
Pero una
and
persona
quite
que mueve
protected.
por una situación de un desastre natural,
But
una
if
violencia
I had to
familiar,
move due to family violence,
puede seguir
domestic violence, natural
también
disaster, etc., the conditions would have been
clima,
very
si es
different.
regular, irregular,
And
en
whether
cualquier sitio,
migration is
forzado,
regular,
forzado.
irregular, forced or not,
Tristemente,
the
podemos ver
conditions
que el
change.
hecho de ser mujer
And
mundo
the
donde hay
fact of
violencia
being
contra las mujeres o
a
violencia
woman
de
in a
género,
world that has
eso sí
gender-based
representa un
violence
riesgo,
does
no es el único
entail a
factor.
certain level of risk, but it's not the only
Toda mujer migrante
factor.
tiene la misma nivel de
So we
vulnerabilidad.
don't have to
Y
assume
eso
that
es
all
lo
migrant women have the
la
same level
actividad
of
que vamos
vulnerability.
a hacer antes de entrar
So
en el
this
modelo.
is the
Catalina,
activity
le
that we are going to
paso.
do before we start
Muchas
with the
gracias,
model
Ross.
itself.
Y efectivamente, la actividad que tenemos es asociada
And
a lo que
the
ustedes
activity is
comentaron.
associated to what
En
was
este
being
caso, de nuevo les pedimos activar la
explained.
herramienta Annotate de Zoom y
Let's
utilizar
go
la
with the
opción de
annotate
más o de ceros.
tool.
En la
And let's
siguiente
go with
tabla,
seals.
perdón, en la siguiente pantalla vamos a tener la pregunta.
And
Justamente lo que le estaba comentando Ross.
this is the question.
¿Son todas las mujeres migrantes
Are all
vulnerables a la explotación,
women
la violencia y el
migrants
abuso?
vulnerable to exploitation, violence,
Respondamos
and abuse?
o no con uno de los
Please
circulitos
put
amarillos.
yes or no
Muchas gracias.
with one of the
Ya me
seals that
apareció
you
el
choose.
resultado en la pantalla. Muchas gracias.
And
Muchas gracias. Excelente. No sé si alguna persona le gustaría tomar el
so
micrófono y
would
decir si
anybody
piensa que no o que sí.
want
Veo que la
to take
mayoría piensa que sí,
the
entonces
mic and
le voy
say
a dar
no?
la posición. Bueno, Josimar piensa que
Josimar
sí.
says yes.
Tenemos un
¿Alguna?
manito, Ana Catalina,
Excelente.
de Fidelina.
Adelante, Fidelina. Muchas gracias.
And
Sí, bueno, yo pensaría más
for
bien
me,
las mujeres que migran son
women
mujeres
who
que tienen
migrate,
una valentía
they
terrible
are
para
brave
poder realizar el tránsito que realizan, ¿verdad? La
to
experiencia que
go
tenemos acá en Costa
through
Rica,
that
tanto de
trip.
aquellas mujeres que vemos en
The experience that
tránsito
we
con
see
esa
in
valentía
transit
increíble que llegan hasta los Estados Unidos,
that
y
go
bueno,
all the way up to the
realmente
US,
para qué, yo diría que son mujeres
I would
súper
say
fuertes,
that they're
que el
very
camino
strong
y
women.
el tránsito y el acceso
That
directo
going
los
through
va haciendo
this and
vulnerables
transit and the
en
access or
muchas
no
ocasiones
access to
en
right
relación a lo que se
makes
topan
them
en los
vulnerable. That
traslados
is,
y que las pueden
that would depend on what
convertir
they
obviamente en
encounter.
explotación y en violencia y abuso. Pero una mujer es muy
Uh,
fuerte cuando
But
migra si
a
las
woman is
son
very
los
strong when they
contextos que
migrate,
llevan a eso.
and it
Eso
would be
pienso.
circumstances that would entail
Muchas
these
gracias,
vulnerabilities.
Fidelina. Rosa, ¿alguna otra persona que quiera participar?
Anybody else would like to participate?
Francisco.
Francisco, adelante,
Francisco.
Francisco.
Francisco, no estamos logrando escuchar.
Francisco, we can't hear you. You're muted.
Ahora sí.
Everybody has said no. And I think, yes, all women can be vulnerable to a form of violence, abuse, or exploitation. You traveled by plane, etc. And but uh, women even traveling this way, they could be, for example, harassed. So I would say that, yeah, in general, they
Si
would
me
be
permite,
vulnerable.
Catalina, creo que es un excelente comentario
And
y
it's an
yo puse
excellent comment.
mi flechita ahí en la barrita.
And I put
Porque creo
my
que depende.
seal
Y depende cómo uno interprete
on
la pregunta y
between the
depende
two,
cómo uno
on how you
piensa.
interpret the question
Si
and
usted
how you
está
think.
refiriendo a
Because if you're
al
talking
riesgo de
about
violencia por el hecho de ser mujer,
violence just because you're a woman, gender-based violence, in most parts of the world,
vulnerabilidad,
that
¿verdad?
can be a
Pero
vulnerable
si
situation.
uno está pensando en depende cuál migrante, qué
The,
mujer migrante,
but
como estábamos escuchando en el
depends
colegio,
on
hay mujeres
the
migrantes
migrant women.
con mucha
Yeah,
fortaleza
we have a lot of women
apoyar
who
sus
are
familiares,
strong enough to migrate to
recursos
support their
migratorios
families.
muy positivos. Entonces ya no es tan
And
sencilla. Entonces tal vez la respuesta es en alguna
maybe
forma en base de violencia
the
por
answers
mujeres
could be
lleven un cierto riesgo.
that
Pero hay
there's always a
muchos
certain risk,
factores, si son
especially
muy
because of
legítimas, si son
gender-based violence.
latinas, si llevan una
But
enfermedad crónica,
how
si
about
son
if they are indigenous
con
women
más o menos educación,
or with
si
a
no
medical
están
condition,
informados
whether
o
they
no? Hay
don't have a
muchos
work
elementos de quiénes
waiting for
ellos
them? There are
son
many elements,
basado en
circumstances
su género que pueden
that
ponerlos en
can
situación de vulnerabilidad.
place
Entonces, la pregunta es
these
para
people in
provocarnos a
vulnerable
nosotros
situations,
pensar
despite
más allá de solo
or
ese
in addition to
elemento,
being
porque
women.
ese elemento es críticamente importante,
This is a
particularmente en
critical
migración
element, of course,
y un
especially
lugar
migration,
peligroso en la región. Sabemos hay mucha
and
violencia.
we have a lot
Catalina,
of
no sé
violence against
si le
women.
gustaría comentar algo más.
Sí, muchísimas gracias. Y sí es un excelente punto.
And it's an
Efectivamente, lo que
excellent
vamos a ver
point.
más adelante en la presentación es que tenemos que estudiar el perfil de
And
la persona.
we have to study the
Tenemos que
profile
hablar
of the person,
no solo de su vida a nivel individual, sino también
and
a nivel
not only the
social,
individual
a nivel
aspect,
de la
but
estructura de la que proviene, ¿verdad? Del
the
Estado,
family, the
los entrenamientos,
structure,
etcétera, que tenemos que tomar en cuenta para determinar la vulnerabilidad de una persona. Y es justamente lo que
and
vamos a empezar a
this is
estudiar en
what
esta
we're going to
sección.
start
Así que
studying this
te doy la
section.
palabra, Rose, para continuar con la presentación y poder explorar
And
estos temas. Muchas gracias.
let's start exploring these
Muchísimas gracias, de
topics.
verdad, por los comentarios muy thoughtful
Thank you for
que
your
nos
thoughtful
ofrecieron en
comments.
esta discusión, porque creo que todo lo que escuchábamos
And
es muy
what do we see? I'm sorry.
Claudia está pidiendo palabra, perdón.
Are you asking for the floor?
Perdón, se abrió el micrófono,
No,
perdón.
so mic opened. Okay.
Adelante, Catalina, por favor. Entonces ahora vamos a ver el
And
modelo en sí. Algunos tal vez están viéndolo ya en
let's
el
see the
slide y luego
model,
lo van a ver cuando tienen el tiempo de completar el curso en línea.
or when
La
you complete
OIM
the
tiene
online course.
25 años de
IOM
trabajar
has
en
been working
términos de
for
justicia
25 years
específicamente
in the
a
protection and
víctimas de
assistance
trata. Es una
of migrants,
asociación usualmente
especially
no
victims of
nuestra.
trafficking.
Hemos
We specialize
asistido
in that.
en este tiempo más de 100,000
We
personas
have
diariamente y como
assisted
muchos de ustedes tal vez saben,
many,
tenemos
and we
fondos de
have
emergencia a nivel
funds
global
for
y
assistance at a
estamos
global
muy activos en
level,
este espacio.
and we are very active in
Actualmente
this
tenemos
space.
40 años de trabajar en asistir
We
migrantes en
have
su
been
retorno
working
voluntario,
in
asistiendo.
assisting migrants
Y entonces,
for voluntary
facto de
return
ello,
for over
nosotros como
40
miles
years.
de migrantes nos hemos
And
dado
so
cuenta
we
en los últimos
have
años de que hay
found
muchos
out
migrantes
and realized that
que
many
no califican
migrants
como víctimas de trata,
that do
que
not
están
qualify as
muy
trafficking
vulnerables.
victims,
Y otros muy
but
vulnerables a
are
la violencia,
vulnerable
a la explotación, a abuso,
to
no existe
exploitation, to abuse,
entonces
or to
un
violence.
marco
So there is
internacional,
no
una definición
really an
internacionalmente aceptada sobre
internationally accepted definition
vulnerable y
of
que
who's vulnerable and
tampoco
who's
no
not.
existía un acuerdo
And
internacional para cómo
there
identificarlos
is no
y asistirles, como
international
por
agreement
ejemplo
to identify and
en el
assist them.
protocolo de Palermo
as we have with the Protocol of Palermo for trafficking victims, or under the Protocol for Gender-Based Violence or violence against children or refugees. And we have a lot of vulnerable migrants, and with no clear guidelines, we worked to provide a guideline to identify these profiles so we can have a plan to assist them and to restore their rights. So late last year, this handbook, the Spanish version should be launched before the end of the year. This is the IAM handbook for protection assistance to migrants that are subject to violence, exploitation, and abuse. It has two specific parts. The first part is the model, determining factors for vulnerability, and this is focus on risk analysis and protection at different levels. And here we have the definition we use for migrants in situation of vulnerability. They cannot effectively exercise their human rights. They have greater risk of abuse of their rights and should require more protection for those guaranteeing rights. So migrants in this situation, they need this protection. There's a new approach. It is a methodology and operational framework. The handbook is quite big, about 300 pages, which has a lot of tools. And the handbook also provides guidelines on how to handle cases and how to handle them with different people. Catalina, can you mute? In addition to having this model to determine the vulnerability of a given person, you have the answer, how can you handle this? So we think it is a very useful aspect. You remember the green book on direct assistance that we have used for many years at the IAM? It is also applicable to victims of trafficking, but includes other migrants. And we are happy to launch this online course for you. So to recap, when we talk about who can be a vulnerable migrant, we talk about very specific aspects like trafficking and who would need international protection. This is established in the legislation, and we have more and more the context of trafficking, and we have more and more recognitions that migrants can be more vulnerable. They can be abused. You also talked about children and adolescents, especially those who are unaccompanied. But we can also talk about migrants with labor exploitation, physical sexual violence, extortion, torture. It will depend on the different contexts. So what we analyzed in this model is to think about this category as a migrant woman would not be enough to be able to reach the risk factors. So there is a risk factor of excluding migrant categories that have mobility, but do not belong to a given category. So if there is no specific protection or inclusion in the current protocols, we are going to have an issue. So this handbook and manual model has to, or plays a very important role then. The model focuses in that all people may have risk factors, but also protection factors. And both of them have to be added or taken into account to check vulnerability factors. For example, I'm a woman and I could be subject to harassment because so we have a protection factor that I have a regular job, I have documents, I have a family that can support me. So we have risk factors and protection factors for each person and under each context, because context is key. Let's talk about the pandemic or a caravan, very specific context that deal a lot with factors, not only individual factors. So we're going to do a little exercise and I'm going to give then the floor to them.
Muchas gracias, Rose. Sí,
Thank
efectivamente,
you,
vamos a hacer
Rose.
un ejercicio para
We have an
empezar a
exercise
ejercitarnos, ¿verdad? A tratar de tener una mejor
to
definición de
try
comunicación de
to
riesgo y,
have
y
more
factores de
skills
protección en un
in
caso
the
de
identification of
operaciones.
risk
Es
and
necesario
protection
tener un
factors.
contexto para poder
Remember,
identificar
we
factores de
need a
riesgo.
context
Por
for
ejemplo,
that
este pequeño
type
pedacito de
of
arriba
exercise.
da
That
información sobre
is in the
¿ok?
paragraph that
Entonces,
gives
lo que
us
vamos a hacer es
information.
leerlo en conjunto
So
y
we are going to
tratamos
read
de
it
identificar y
jointly and
clasificar
then
los factores
we
de
are going to
riesgo y
identify
factores de protección.
the factors and classify them as
Entonces,
risk
le
or
pediría a uno o
protection
alguna voluntaria que alguien me
factors.
pudiera ayudar a leernos
So
la primera oración.
can anybody help me read the
Por favor,
first
tome el micrófono y empecemos.
sentence so we can start?
Francisco.
Francisco. Osman is a student, very well known, but his education has been interrupted because there have been severe floods.
Si gusta seguir, está bien, excelente.
Or if you want to continue, yeah, sure. A woman approaches him and offers him a job as a fisherman in a neighboring country that can help him support his family that are in debt. And according to the recruiting agent, she or he would be able to support his entire family because and even the community because the members have been displaced. He rejects the offer because his parents and friends have warned him about these scams. The government has announced an action plan to repress these scam activities. So right now, we need to identify are the different factors in the context and classify them as either as risk or
En la primera
protection.
línea tenemos que
First
Osman
line
es un estudiante destacado. Aquí tenemos una
or
información.
sentence. We have,
Osman es un
he
estudiante.
is a student.
¿Ustedes consideran que esto es un factor de riesgo o es un factor de
Risk
protección?
or protection factor?
De protección, es un factor de
De
protección.
protección.
De protección.
Excelente, muy bien.
Protection factor. Okay.
Okay. La siguiente información que nos da
The
la
next
investigación
sentence
es que su
or the same
ocupación
sentence.
se ha interrumpido.
but education has been
¿Esto podría ser un
interrupted.
factor de riesgo o un factor de protección?
Risk or protection
De riesgo, ¿verdad?
would be risk
Si
factor.
uno va a la escuela o al colegio, no sabemos en qué
In other words, the protection factor has been interrupted,
debido a alguna circunstancia
posing a
que
risk,
está sucediendo en su país, ya él ya no tiene
because
más salida.
now he is facing a circumstance
Justamente esta misma línea nos indica
that
qué es lo que está pasando en su país o en su comunidad.
has been caused
Que hay graves
by
inundaciones.
severe
¿Esto
floods.
sería un factor de riesgo o un factor de
So
protección?
the flooding, risk or protection?
De riesgo. Excelente. Muy bien.
Sure, natural disaster.
¿Hay alguna persona que quiera hacer el mismo ejercicio con la línea 2?
Who would like to do the same thing for the second sentence? Any volunteers?
¿No tenemos a nadie que quiera tomar la palabra y hacer la línea 2?
Anybody would like to?
Hola.
The second sentence, yeah. The woman is offering work as a fisherman, neighboring country. I think that is risk factor. This late job opportunity. Why do you think it is risk? Because of the context.
Que es un trabajo que tiene salario.
It is especially when you're being offered a job that has a salary that is usually above the usual pay grade. Very important. It is a fisherman. We don't know his age. He could be a university student or high school. But it is a neighboring country, so it is not in his community. He will have to go to another country. We don't know whether they speak the same language Osman speaks or the culture. It is something that has to be considered. So would have to leave his country. A woman is offering that job. Would have no information about the recruiter. So we have some red flags here that we have to take into account. And the next row says that the money is good enough to help the family that is in debt. We have an issue. We have the families in debt. This can be a risk factor, of course. Osman feels the pressure of helping the family, and maybe he thinks that this opportunity being offered could be the ticket to help his family. However, according to the information, she's saying, okay, the money is so good, you could offer your, you could support your community. That's another indicator. I'm going to be a fisherman and I'm going to be earning a very high salary, being able to help the family and the whole community. In the second or the next part, that the people have been displaced by the catastrophe. Not only we had a catastrophe because we have a drought, so we have several risk factors. And the other one that goes to Osman, from Osman to traffickers.
la línea.
So, any volunteer?
Creo que fue
Ok.
Juan en algún
Juan.
momento.
I think Juan.
Alcé mi mano para leer,
Yeah,
pero
I raised my hand to read. Yeah,
Ok,
sure.
muchas gracias.
sí, estamos en la línea de Osman rechazó la oferta, ¿verdad?
So
Ajá.
he rejected the offer.
Mm, yo creo que es un factor de protección
It
porque
is a
él debería
protection
haber
factor
advertido por sus padres y amigos.
because he was warned.
Vimos de los tratos
He had
que
information about these
son muy,
scams,
¿cómo diríamos?
so he is
Consciente de los riesgos,
aware
lo cual
of the
para mí
risks.
sería un factor
So
protección.
it is a protection factor.
La estampita de protección.
So let's put it as protection
Excelente,
factor.
muchas gracias, Juan. Y sí, efectivamente, el hecho
Yeah,
de tener
effectively.
una red de apoyo, como sus padres,
Having
sus
a
amigos,
support
les permitió
network
a Osman decir, ah, no, aquí hay
has
algo mal, voy a tener que
allowed
rechazar esta
Osman
oferta porque
to see
no me cuadra
that there
la
may be
situación, ¿verdad?
something off about this offer.
Es un factor de protección, efectivamente. Tener una
So
red
this is a
de
protection
apoyo que te
factor,
advierte
having a
sobre los
support
riesgos
network
que puede
that
estar
can warn you
en una
about the
situación como
risks
esta.
you might
Efectivamente,
be
muchas
facing.
gracias. Y finalmente
And
tenemos
finally,
la línea de que va de el gobierno
we
a
go
los
from
de ellos.
government
El gobierno ha anunciado un plan de acción
to
para
the
revertir las actitudes de
action
ellos.
plan
¿Alguna
to
persona quiere indicarnos si este es
fight
un factor de
their
protección
activities,
o
protection factor or risk
es
factor.
un factor de protección o de
What do you
riesgo?
think it is, a protection or risk factor?
Hola, es un factor de protección porque el gobierno
Protection
está tomando
factor
cartas en el
because
asunto y
the
bueno,
government
para mi manera de ver
is
las cosas,
taking
es muy
steps.
irresponsable de la
So
parte
the
de
government
los tratantes
is
de
trying to
combate la
fight
trata.
these
Gracias, Manny. Excelente
traffickers.
respuesta, sí. Efectivamente es un factor de protección.
So it is
Muy bien.
a
Entonces, en resumen,
protection factor.
hemos logrado identificar como factores de riesgo
So we have
la
identified
interrumpida,
risk factors,
la
the interruption in
familia
education,
dañada,
the death of the
la
family,
oportunidad laboral que parece ser fraudulenta
the opportunity
tenemos las
which
grandes
appears to
inversiones
be
y las
fraudulent,
personas desplazadas.
the disaster which is
Como factores de protección en el
the
plan,
floods and the
identificamos
displaced
el plan de
populations.
acción del
And
gobierno,
protection is
que
the government's
Osman
action
es un
plan.
estudiante destacado,
Osman is a
porque
student,
Osman ha sido advertido por sus
has
padres y
been
amigos sobre
already
los
warned
riesgos.
by
Hablamos de que existe una red de
parents
apoyo
and
familiar
friends
y
about
del
the
hecho de que
risks,
el gobierno está tomando
a support
acciones.
network,
Va a
and that the
iniciar un
government
plan de acción
is
para
taking
prevenir esas
matters in
situaciones
its
de
own hands
posible trata de personas
to
o
try to
de
prevent
explotación
this
laboral,
possible
parece ser.
traffic
Entonces,
for
muchísimas
possible
gracias.
exploitation.
Esta información
Thank
destacada
you
la vamos a
very much.
retomar en las
And
siguientes filmitos
we are going
para
to retake this in
como
the
otro
next
ejercicio de clasificación. Entonces,
slides to
gracias,
continue with
Catherine.
the classification.
Muchas gracias por toda la participación en el
Thank
chat
you
también.
for the
Ya
participation.
puedo borrarlo, ¿verdad? Para seguir.
Can I erase it? Yeah.
Excelente. Muchas gracias, Ruth.
Gracias, Catalina.
Thank you.
Entonces podemos seguir.
Let's keep.
Ahí va. Gracias. Perfecto. Entonces,
So,
para seguir analizando cómo
to continue
podría tratar
analyzing
en un caso específico
how you look at the
de
different
de
factors
un migrante
in a
en situación
specific
vulnerable,
case,
hay que ver 4 niveles
you have
de
to look
análisis
at
y posible
4
intervención.
levels of
Uno
analysis
a un
and possible
nivel
intervention.
individual, uno a
One
nivel de la
at
familia
the
o
level of the
hogar,
person,
uno a
another
nivel
would be
comunitario
the
relevante, que
family
es
or the
donde se
household,
encuentra o donde se
the
va,
community
y
where
uno
they
a
are, where
nivel
they're leaving,
estructural o contextual.
and
Y el
protection and
modelo de los
structural.
determinantes de vulnerabilidad
And
lleva
the
a
model
analizar esos diferentes
will
dimensiones.
allow us
Adelante.
to see these different contexts.
Gracias. Catalina, no sé si le gustaría hacer ese
Catalina,
parte.
would you like
De
to
acuerdo, Ruth. Muy bien.
continue with this
Entonces,
part?
como les decíamos anteriormente,
So as we said before,
esta es la información del caso que tuvimos
this
previamente, el caso de
is the
Osman.
information
Lo
that we
que queremos
had.
hacer en esta oportunidad es que aquí tenemos
And
los factores que
we
identificamos de
are
riesgo y de
going to
protección.
have,
Vemos, por ejemplo, a la izquierda, en las cajitas verdes están los factores
we
de
see
protección.
here
Cajitas que son como color café.
the protection
Están los
factors.
factores de
to the left. And then in brown, we have the risk factors. And then we have the information. A protection factor that we identified is that he is a student, a good student. And we're going to see the different factors. We are going to see what type of factors they are. Structural, family, individual. So we're going to work with the different little letters. So, for example, being a good student is I for individual factor. So it's an individual factor. And we see that interrupted education is a risk factor. So we see structural factors, family, community, and we're going to give the classification we think it to which it corresponds. So we are putting the different C's for community, interrupted education. How about floods, or anybody wants to take the mic and explain the reasoning? You're welcome. E, structural, for the floods. I also, interrupted education can be structural as well as individual. The debts would be family. And then we see displacement, a C, because it is community. How about the advice from family and friends? What type of classification? Community, yeah. Then the next one would be the scams of the traffickers. What factors? Yeah, structural. Action plan by the government against trafficking, which is structural. Anybody would like to take the mic and explain some of these factors? We see some of the factors. You see some of the classifications. Anybody would like to tell us what you had different classifications?
No, hay participación activa en la Filmina y también.
There is no participation. Yes. The factor here can be individual, community. They can be the different factors and depends on the focus. For example, here, and being a good student can be also family. Interrupted education, as you said, is a factor that not only affects Osman individually, but structurally, because we have many students who can no longer go to school. And this also affects the community. And we see that the emergency of the community and the interruption of the education, which affects the community and can affect the family. The big floods have been localized or not. There can be a factor that affect the community structure, general, because the government it's going to have
Podemos
to
con
dedicate
cada uno de
resources
estos
for that.
puntos, podemos hacer un análisis
So we can
contextualizado
have
y
a
podemos determinar
contextualized
cuál de estos
analysis to
factores
determine
es el que está
the type
predominando. Por
of
ejemplo,
factor that
veo que hay un
predominates.
micrófono activo, no sé si alguien
I
quiere.
think that somebody opened their mic. Would you like to participate?
Veo, no sé si Francisco, si estaba pidiendo la palabra.
Francisco was asking for
No,
the floor.
hay un comentario también en el chat.
We
Ajá.
have a comment
Que
in
los
the
factores
chat
pueden ser analizados en
that
conjunto y
factors can
además
be analyzed
y además puede ser una
together,
herramienta que ayude a poder buscar una solución.
and this can help find a solution.
Exacto, es un muy buen punto, excelente.
Very good point.
Ok, entonces ya tenemos identificado
We
cómo
have
mapear en este
identified
caso, en un
how
contexto,
to map
contexto
this
y protección.
case in
Ahora
context
cómo los podemos clasificar por nivel.
and how to
Ya vimos los
classify
cuatro
them
niveles que trabaja el
as
SWOT y
the different
efectivamente la
levels.
persona que indicó en el chat
As
nos
was
ayuda a buscar la
identified in
respuesta
the
más
chat,
adecuada a la situación que
this
se
can give us a better
y ya lo dijiste
response
por acá, Rose, no sé si
to the
tienes algún otro
situation.
comentario antes de que avancemos.
Any other comments do we have before we continue? So you can take the floor. Juan?
Sí, gracias, Ros. Mi pregunta es más
My
como
question
global,
is more like global in nature.
con el curso autodirigido que hemos
And
realizado
with the
con el tema
self-paced course
campus de OIM.
that we've had in the
Y
e-campus
justamente también
and
hay un
of the
ejercicio
IOM,
similar
we had a
en
very
curso
similar exercise in this course
de clasificación de esas categorías.
where we would classify these categories,
Punto o una ventana de oportunidad,
and
si me
it is going to give us an opportunity.
si el handbook o
And tell me whether the handbook
elaboraron
or this manual that you have
lineamientos para
identified has a series of guidelines.
cada gestor de casos o de cada
So
persona
it is
público, digamos,
it is not subjected to interpretation, really,
que atienda el caso a la persona, para que se genere como una evaluación,
to generate
mucho más
an evaluation
mucho más objetiva,
or objective evaluation based on
el propio manual
criteria,
se hace adrede como para que sea amplio, ¿no? Me
or
sorprende
whether
mucho
it
un
is
ejercicio
done
porque
on
yo también
purpose.
tuve varios errores
Because I've seen a few mistakes in the exercise
un cierto orden,
because you need a certain order
y aquí veo que también
in
los
the
colegas están teniendo
classification.
como de cierta manera esas
And our colleagues are also having sometimes their doubts or concerns.
nivel, ¿no? Entonces eso es más mi duda
So that would be
conceptual,
more my global
unas pautas de
question. Can you give us some information on what would be individual, family?
Entonces esa es mi duda. Gracias.
So
No, muchas gracias por traerlo porque creo que es un
thank
tema
you
muy
for bringing
importante.
this to
En
the
términos
table.
de las
In
definiciones
terms
y las descripciones que
of
hay,
definitions
también
and
hay
descriptions that we
una
have in the
serie
manual,
de herramientas para
we have a
ayudar
series of
a
tools
aplicar cuestionarios, por ejemplo, a
to
diferentes
help
niveles,
apply
nivel de riesgo, a diferentes niveles.
questionnaires, for
Entonces,
example, at
la
different
idea es
levels.
que estas herramientas
So
den
the
ayuda mucho
idea
más
is
de forma más
that
rigurosa y
we
específica.
are using
Yo
these tools
creo que hay un
to provide a bit
cierto
more
espacio
rigor,
gris y nivel de
but we have
sensibilidad que
some
depende
gray
del contexto exacto.
aspects
Entonces, de mi
or
parte,
gray
yo
areas.
creo que necesariamente hay una respuesta claramente
So I
correcta
don't
que
see if
sería
we
la
have
incorrecta. Yo creo que
correct or
va a depender
incorrect
mucho la situación específica.
answer,
Entonces, las
more
herramientas
like the
de seguir
specific
indagar la
situation,
información, pero la interpretación de la información de
the
el nivel de riesgo
interpretation of
es
this,
más o menos
whether the risk
comunitario,
is
estructural
more
o establecido
structural or
de forma específica.
communitary,
También
is
sabemos
not that
que vamos
strict.
evaluando y monitoreando para
And
ir
we
mejorando las
are
herramientas.
evaluating and monitoring these
Creo
tools.
que la
So
idea, eso fue
I
desarrollado
think
y piloteado y
that
usado,
this
pero
was
no ha sido usado.
piloted,
Ya que está lanzándose a nivel global,
but whether
anticipo que vamos a ir aprendiendo
you're
a
seeing
poder
this more and more
desarrollar si hay
globally,
alguna
this can help us see
precisándonos en esas
if there are any missing
evaluaciones
components on how to
vulnerabilidad.
provide
Pero creo que sí se puede
follow-up
tomar en alguna
within this
forma
context of vulnerability.
conjuntamente con cierta subjetividad.
But
Creo que eso es necesario
together with a certain subjective nature,
y cada persona es un mundo.
we have to take into account that different contexts are different
Uno
worlds.
puede decir que eso es
And we
como
can
parte
say
de la
that
cultural y no creo que eso
we have
y el
more
uso de los instrumentos. La
problems
importancia es no pensar solamente en
that
lo
can
individual
be
y analizar un
considered
poco a esos
in
otros
a
factores.
broader context,
Y también el
not only
manejo
individual,
lleva
not
a
only
escribir un
structural.
plan por cada
And this allows us to build a
situación que
plan
pueden
per
aplicar
level
en el
that
momento de
can help you
aplicación de la
clarify
respuesta,
when
de la
applying
respuesta.
the
No sé,
response.
Catalina, si quiere comentar cualquier otra
I don't
cosa
know whether
Andrea.
Katarina would like to comment on
Sí,
this.
muchísimas gracias. Bueno, también es que en el contexto que estamos trabajando,
And
normalmente es con un
within the
grupo de
context we're
participantes
working,
y tenemos muy pocos elementos de
this
juicio.
was
Entonces no
a
tenemos
fictitious
únicamente para preguntar a la persona e indagar un poco más a
case.
fondo lo que está sucediendo, sino que también es un
We don't
ejercicio
have a lot
básico
of
de
information.
clasificación.
This was
Entonces
just a
todos están
classification
como un poco
exercise. And the
divididos, ¿verdad?
same
Están un
thing
poco
happened
divididos en
in the
equipos y la
self-paced
parte de
course
la
with the other
educación están
limitation
programados, ¿verdad?
where
Entonces no
the
hay
answers
realmente
have already been
una
programmed.
revisión, una retroalimentación. Entonces,
So there's not
lo
much
que
in terms
usualmente
of
decimos es,
feedback.
como
Just
dice
to
Rose,
tell you,
esto no es que se preste mucho
as
porque sea
Rose
demasiado
said,
amplio o
it
muy
is not
abierto, sino
that
que
it's going to be
depende
too
mucho de la
broad or
información
too
que podamos tener en el
ambiguous,
caso y de la
but
información que tengamos.
depends on the information that we have
Nos
available,
permite pensar un poquito
and
más
also
allá de la
allows
situación
us
individual
to
y poder
think
centrarnos un poco
beyond
en lo que es
individual
un poco más
aspects
holístico y lo que
and
puede ser de
see
todas
a
las
more holistic
variantes y situaciones que puede estar
changes
atravesando la persona, ¿verdad?
and the different
Entonces es también un ejercicio como de irnos de
situations
esa
for
realidad
the
del escenario
individual.
individualmente y abrirnos un poco más
So we can
pensar en
see
niveles estructurales,
a bit
comunitarios de la
more in
familia.
structural
Entonces es más un
levels or
ejercicio como de
community-based
análisis
levels for the family.
de interpretación, en donde obviamente tenemos factores que nos van guiando en el manual,
And
¿verdad?
we
Hay unos
have
indicadores,
factors
hay
that
información
are
que nos dice
guiding
exactamente
us
qué puede considerarse dentro del
and
concepto de
what can
comunidad,
be
por ejemplo,
considered, for
y
example, as concept
entonces
of
tenemos
family,
bastantes guías.
of
Pero también
household,
depende mucho de la
but it also
información que
depends a
tengamos.
lot of the about
Cómo
the information
clasifiquemos
we
cada
have
uno de estos
and
factores. Pero
how
no
we
solamente,
classify
sino
the
simplemente nos
factors.
permite
This
tener
is
una visión
not
más amplia
good or bad
del caso y poder
itself.
dar una mejor respuesta.
It is basically that they are
Gracias,
to be
Catalina.
taken
Mientras que
jointly
vamos
to
pasando
give a
a
better
la
response.
segunda, yo agregaría que si
And I
tenemos
would
en las
also like to
pruebas
add
de
that
autoaprendizaje,
if in the
usted
self-paced
cree que hay
course
preguntas subjetivos, por
you
favor
think
háganos
there are
saberlo en la
subjective
evaluación para que más
questions,
mejoras
please
puedan hacer.
tell us because these are
Y si
improvements that we
usan una
can make to the
información más
course.
grande, se dan
And until
cuenta
you
de
test it with
preguntas
a
que
bigger
pueden
population,
ser
you might
interpretadas de
realize
diferentes formas.
that
Entonces
there are some
ahí
questions that could be interpreted in different ways. So that
mejorarse
is
en los quizzes
something that we could improve.
del curso. Entonces, muchas gracias, colega.
So thank you
Ahora
very
entonces
much.
vamos a
Now,
seguir viendo el
let's
modelo.
continue
Obviamente,
looking
cuando
at the
hacemos
model.
este análisis,
Obviously,
puede pasar
when we are doing this analysis,
la
this can
experiencia
happen in
de la
any
migración.
part of the
Uno
experience
puede
of
tener una
migration.
nueva situación
We can have a new
luego se le
situation.
puede pasar a uno como individual o a familiar,
Something can
en algún
happen to
momento
you
de
as
su migración
as an
de
individual.
toma de decisión antes de salir, como por ejemplo
For example, decision
la
making.
violencia antes que le hace
For example,
migrar o
you
que vino
suffered a
por su
violence
trabajo y tener que migrar
that forced
durante
you
momentos de
to
tránsito,
migrate
etapas de
because
tránsito,
you
incluyendo
lost your
el
job.
destino y también después
You
de
have to
llegar
go
a
to
tierra.
different communities,
Entonces hay
transit
que pensar muy bien
destination,
dónde
even
estamos en ese
return.
proceso y qué fue
So we need
lo
to
que
know
pasó.
where we are in this
Ujú.
process, in this cycle.
Entonces vamos a ver un poco más
Now we
ejemplos
will see some
similar a lo que
examples
estábamos trabajando, ¿no?
like we saw
Entonces
before.
imaginamos que tenemos este señor
We
enfrente
have
de nosotros que
this
también está en el
migrant.
tránsito.
He
Entonces
is in
dice
a
que sabemos
transit
que es un hombre
uh,
de 28
space.
años.
He's
¿Usted
28 years
vería
old.
un factor de riesgo o de protección?
Risk or protection
Pueden
factor.
decirlo con voz si
20-year-old
quiere o con
male. You
imágenes.
can use the chat or the mic.
Que sea un hombre de 28 sería
28-year-old
protectiva
male. Protection or risk factor.
veo en el chat protección. Sí,
Protection.
efectivamente
Effectively.
puede ser algo de protección. Gracias, colegas. La próxima cosa que sabemos
The
sobre
next
este
one
señor
is
que tiene una historia de violencia.
he has a history
Ese
of
puede ser un factor
violence.
de riesgo o de protección.
Risk or protection.
Y si
El
no,
riesgo.
riesgo, exacto.
That would be
Puede ser
risk.
riesgo. Imaginamos, por ejemplo, que sufrió
For
violencia
example,
frente a una mara. Eso puede
he
ser un
had
riesgo.
he suffered violence at the hands of a gang, for example.
él es que vive en un barrio
He lives
marginado.
in
Riesgo
a
o
slum,
protección.
marginalized community. Risk or protection?
Marcando riesgo, poniendo
People
riesgo
are putting
definitivamente.
risk.
El hecho que vive en un barrio que puede tener
So
menos servicios, menos
he
apoyo,
lives
etcétera, puede
somewhere
ser
where they
riesgo.
could
En
have a
este
scarcity of
caso,
services
vemos que él viene de una
or
comunidad
protection
consolidada
network.
en el Estado de Derecho.
And he comes from a community
Y eso sería
where the
factor
rule
de
of law
riesgo.
is weak,
Entonces, rápidamente
which is
veamos en un
also a
análisis
risk
un poco más profundo
factor.
lo que
So a
pasa
bit more
con
in-depth
una
analysis.
persona de bajo vulnerabilidad
The
para ver más
person
que ser un
who
hombre y
at
ser
first
un
appeared to
adulto
be a
mayor
low
resulta
risk
tener más factores de riesgo que una persona que sale.
individual
Entonces, rápidamente tenemos más
in terms of his
riesgo de
migration
protección.
vulnerability
Ejemplos que vamos a ver
is
en las próximas
someone who
slides.
has a much
Una
higher
persona
degree of
migrante,
risk.
ella está en
Now
un
let's look at a
destino.
migrant woman. She's
Entonces, lo
in at the
primero que
destination.
sabemos de ella es que es mujer.
First,
¿Eso
she's a
puede ser
woman.
factor de riesgo o protección?
Risk or protection?
Bueno, si pensamos en el factor de violencia
If
contra
we're talking
mujeres
about
y
gender-based
discriminación contra
violence and
mujeres,
discrimination against women,
podría ser un factor de riesgo.
we
En
can
este ejemplo lo
then
vemos
say
así.
it would be a
El
risk
hecho de ser
factor.
mujer le puede ponerle en una situación de riesgo.
And
Pero algo más que sabemos de
also,
ella es que viene de
she
una familia
comes
con un alto
from a
nivel de
highly
educación.
educated
¿Eso sería un factor
family.
de riesgo o de protección?
Risk or protection?
Veo personas marcando protección, poniendo
Protection.
protección. Sí, correcto.
Yeah, protection.
Una familia con un poco más de recursos y educación
A
podría
family
ser
that has
factor de
more
riesgo o
education, more
podría
resources can
simplemente
provide
ayudar,
protection
ayudar.
and
La
support if needed.
tercera elemento
Third
que
one,
descubrimos de ella es que vive en un barrio privilegiado.
she
Eso
lives
sería un factor
in
de
a privileged
protección.
neighborhood, in
Excelente.
other words, posh place.
Sí.
Protection,
Y entonces finalmente hay una brecha
but
jurídica en esta
there
comunidad donde
is
hay
lack
protección para
of
esta
legal
mujer y
protection for
protección
women
para
in that place of
riesgo.
destination,
Entonces,
which is a
así
risk
mezclada,
factor.
tenemos factores
We
protectores y
have a
factores de
mixed profile.
riesgos,
We have
pero hay una
protection
leve
risk factors,
inclinación al lado de
but
protección
there is a
debido a
slightly
su
more
situación
protection due
familiar
to
y
her status and
comunitaria.
her family's
Entonces, otra
status.
vez, viéndola solamente como mujer,
So
uno puede
just
decir,
looking at
bueno,
her
tiene
as a
algo de
woman, she will say, okay, vulnerable migrant. Yes, there are elements of
pero si uno
risk and
analiza más en
vulnerability.
este contexto,
But if you
lo
go
que
more
vemos
in
en el
depth,
chat, que gente diciendo
and I
depende,
saw in the chat, and
tenemos
a
otro
lot of people
factor de
said
protección que se
depends.
aplica a ella y que ella
We
misma
have
se está
protection
sabiendo
factors
con
that
más
may apply
nivel
to
de
her,
protección que las
and
las
that
últimas
she has
generaciones.
now more protection factors than the
Sí,
previous
señora,
gentleman.
Catalina. Y gracias, colegas, por participar.
And thank you
Entonces,
for
resumiendo
participating.
este modelo,
So
hay
summarizing
que identificar
this
los
model,
factores de riesgo
we have to identify
a los diferentes niveles, a nivel
the different
individual,
factors of risk or
familia, hogar,
protection,
comunitario y
individual,
institucional,
family,
una mezcla de los
community,
mismos,
structural,
para ver qué respuesta, qué
to see
servicio, qué atención y
what
protección se puede ofrecer.
response, services,
Este plan de
protection can
respuesta
be
responde al
provided.
riesgo
This
en lo
response plan
posible, pero
shall
también
address the risks
ayuda
when
a la
possible, but should
resiliencia en lo
also
posible.
promote
Entonces, si hay factores
resilience.
positivos, queremos
We have
tomarlos
positive
en
factors.
cuenta en
We
nuestro
want to
plan de
take them
asistencia. Y es
into
algo que
account
ustedes
in
van a
our
hacer
assistance plan.
asistiendo a personas en
If
situación de
you are providing
vulnerabilidad.
assistance, especially in
Evidencia de un red
for
familiar
people in vulnerable
que tiene acceso
situations,
a apoyo
we can see
familiar
that, for
privilegiado,
example, a family support
seguro,
network
etcétera, por los
or
apoyos,
providing
es un
shelter.
factor de
So
protección
that would be a protection
que se toma
factor
en cuenta, ¿verdad?
that is taken into
Entonces,
account.
otra vez, eso es el enfoque que queremos dar
So
de
that
ambos lados,
is
al lado de
the
riesgo y al lado
approach
de
we want.
protección.
Okay,
Seguimos con la
balancing risk
siguiente.
with
Entonces,
protection.
para cerrar el modelo,
And to
y
close
esta
this model,
es parte de la sesión,
and this would
vemos
be
que
part of the
tenemos un
session,
niño, niña o
we are
adolescente.
going to see
El hecho
this
que sea
child,
un menor de edad es un factor de
so a minor,
riesgo,
risk
¿verdad?
or protection factor.
Entonces, sí, riesgo, exacto.
It is a risk factor.
Tiene un padre que está capacitado, pero en
And
este momento
the
desempleado.
father is a
El
trained
hecho que sea un
individual,
papá
but is
con
currently
desempleado
unemployed.
puede ser un factor de riesgo.
That can be a risk
Este ejemplo es un poco
factor,
mezclada porque el hecho que tiene cierta capacidad
but
para cierta industria
having the capability for certain industry could be positive. He lives somewhere where there's a high level of employment. So that could be protection factor. And we have a gap in the laws protecting children. So we are identifying risk factors, protection factors, a mixture of them. And this is going to be part of our response plan. We are going to try to address needs, reduce risks, and if we have any protection aspects, take them into account. Thank you, Catalina. And I think we have quickly gone over the model, and you will also see it in our self-paced course. So to close this presentation and to have a little bit of Q&A, we will continue with existing guidelines. In addition to this manual, we have the course that we are also going to launch with a toolkit. And this is going to be available in Spanish as soon as possible. And before the end of the year, available in Spanish. And we see guidelines. We have the guidelines of 2013 that we are updating. That's going to be another very important tool. And we have some other aspects of guidelines for protection of children within the context of migration, as well also the new handbook to determine the best interest of the child, which was mentioned, which is also being completed. All these are complementary handbooks or guidelines that we can have, in addition to, for example, other instruments such as country guidelines. So, detecting vulnerability, being able to determine who is a vulnerable migrant, beyond knowing that there's a person who is seeking asylum as a victim of trafficking. We have another world of migrants that seek assistance, and they are not being identified or classified. So if we are not able to identify those who need our support, they will not receive it. They can be rejected, detained, re-victimized, even returned or deported. So the first step is to detect these people in vulnerable situations and to offer suitable assistance. And the countries that are handling many migrant flows, including the transit destination, this is a daily challenge. In some cases, we have visas to protect these migrants in other vulnerability contexts beyond asylum seekers, victims of trafficking. So we hope that the international community will continue taking protection to these people, which is so important. And once we identify their vulnerabilities, we will be able to identify protection factors and activate assistance and protection factors that are suitable to the profile of the person. Remember, this is integrated assistance for the physical, psychological, mental, and social well-being of the person in cooperation with protection systems such as those for the protection of children, respond to gender-based violence, consumer protections, NGOs play a essential role, etc. The handbook, we're not going to discuss it in this session, but over half of this manual deals with the assistance, provision of assistance at different levels. So we're talking about the different levels. It's not only to identify the factors at an individual, family, community, or structural context, but the different programs for support of service providers, key actors, and the different levels at which protection can be provided so everybody is coordinated and cooperated. To summarize, we need to prevent and address vulnerability and risk factors, identify protection factors to strengthen them throughout the cycle, because first we are protecting the rights, of course, and we need to identify those people to be able to help. I think this is the last activity. So Catalina, you have the floor. Thank you, Rose. This is the final activity. We want to ask you to go to menti.com. The code is different this time, the one on the screen. That is 2235 2049. So let's go to menti.com and enter the code on your screen. You will also see it in the next slide. Let's go to the next slide. And we see people that are already going in. Let's see if it works for us. Now we're going to go to the online application. We have sometimes issue with many questions at the same time. We also have it in the chat, the code. And it's going to the name. And you can leave your current name.
Entonces, si ya estamos listos y listas, vamos a empezar.
So,
Sí, sí, mejor vamos a la versión en línea.
let's see. Okay, let's go to the online version then.
Me avisan si la pueden ver.
Todavía no, estamos viendo el PowerPoint.
Ok, veo que han ingresado 4 personas.
No podemos ver todavía, Catalina.
No pueden verla.
We still cannot see it.
PowerPoint.
Gracias.
¿Ahora?
Sí, ahora sí. Ahora
Ahora sí.
estamos viendo. Muchas gracias.
Excelente. A ustedes. Ok, ya tenemos.
So, we have 18 participants and an interesting collection of avatars. So we have a few questions and you have to answer them quickly. First one. Question number 1. Okay, we have 4 in total. Let's go to question number 1. Okay, to determine vulnerability of a migrant person, you also need to analyze its risks and protection factors at the individual level, true or false. 13 seconds to answer. True or false, only individual factors need be checked. So most people who said it's false, 4 say it's true. It is false because individual, you need structural, community, and family factors to take into account. So here we have Francisco's number, first number, and then Juan de Dios and Rita.
Vamos a
Now,
avanzar a la siguiente pregunta.
second question.
Vamos a
The
ver,
question
siguiente
says,
pregunta. Entonces,
regardless of migration
regardless de la
condition,
condición migratoria,
everyone has a
cada
right to the
persona
protection
tiene
of the
derecho a
state where
protegerse
they
del país
are.
donde se
True
encuentra.
or
¿Es esto
false?
falso o verdadero? Y tenemos 17 segundos para responder.
So 15
El que
seconds.
responde más rápido gana más puntos.
Remember, the faster you answer, the more points you get.
Tenemos ahora 7 segundos.
Okay.
Y el tiempo acabó.
And time's up.
Vamos a ver la
And
respuesta.
we have true.
Ok, tenemos 15 personas que dijeron que es verdadero y 2 personas que
And
dijeron
just to say it's
la respuesta.
false, it is
Pero,
true.
¿verdad? Todas las personas, independientemente de su condición migratoria,
Regardless of their migration status, all people, as our colleague said, just because they're human beings, have human rights, and that includes the protection of the state where they are. Next question.
Perdón, acá tenemos la tabla de posiciones
Oh,
nuevamente.
first, let's go with
Y sigue
the
dominada por
table.
Francisco, Juan de Dios y Rita.
Okay, the
Felicidades a
first,
los tres. Ahora sí, avanzamos a la siguiente pregunta.
okay, next one.
A la pregunta 3 de 4. Vamos a ver.
Question 3 says, the model of determining factors for vulnerability of migrants integrates a component of resiliency.
Componente de resiliencia para afrontar,
True or false?
o recuperarse del daño. ¿Es esto correcto o es esto falso? Tenemos 13 segundos para responder.
But remember, component of resilience. True or false?
Ok, se nos va a acabar el tiempo. Ok, ya tenemos el tiempo. Y 14 personas dicen que sí, que esto es verdadero.
14
y
say
10
yes.
personas dicen que es falso.
And 2 say it's false. There is a resilience component. That is where protection factors come in. So we can design a plan to strengthen these factors and allow the person to face and recover. Let's go back to our positions. We still, now we have Juan de Dios is first place, and then Francisco fell to number 2. Yeah, first 6 places are really close. And last question. And the last question says, before proceeding with return, we must verify that people will not have high risk that place them in danger in their country of origin. It is very specific question. So before returning people, make sure they will not be in danger in their country of origin. And then we have a time up. Everybody said true. It is true. So everyone agrees. This is actually true. We have to verify all factors that surround the person and make sure that returning that person will not place them at a higher risk. So let's see our winners.
Okay.
And Juan de Dios is our winner. So virtual chocolate for you. Thank you very much, Catalina. And we have reached the end of this session. We are going to go with some conclusions, and then we're going to give the floor back to Luis Alonso and Gustavo. So how the next section will be handled. So let's go and project our conclusions.
Perfecto, ahí viene.
Listo.
Sí,
Ahí está.
muchas gracias. Entonces, nada más para recapitular un poco.
So to recap this session, first we know that we have very different profiles for migrants, and we need to see which need protection. So in addition to their appearance, identity, etc., there are other factors that can place them in a situation of vulnerability. That's why we analyze the individual, their family or household, their community, and any structural or contextual or situation factors that may determine their level of vulnerability. This is to be able to refer them to suitable specialized services and assistance, of course. Next one. So today we brought you the handbook, and here are some elements of the manual. Is to recognize that some migrants are more vulnerable than others, and that migration may exacerbate existing vulnerabilities. In addition to situations during migration that can make things worse, this exposure to risk and access to protection will be determining factors for vulnerability. Therefore, the model for determining vulnerabilities does comprise all these different factors to consider their vulnerability, including their resilience factors. And all risk factors and protection factors taken into account will result in the vulnerability profiles. And they are, or they exist throughout the cycle. The factors exist before they leave the country of origin, during transit, arriving at destination, and even potentially in a process of return or after the return. So the objective of the course and the manual and the model is to offer a more structured approach to understand migrant vulnerability, analyzing risk factors, protection factors at the different levels: individual, household, family, community, and structural. We really want to thank you for your attention. We are going to have a Q&A section. So Luis Alonso, please let us know how we continue. Yes, thank you, Rose. We have learned quite a bit, and we have been even entertained with these interactive activities. Thank you, because really your training sessions are always really fun. And we would have Jorge Salcedo and Gustavo, if you have any comments.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Sí, muchas gracias, licenciado Serrano. Bien, pues
Well,
la verdad muy agradecido con todos los participantes.
we really want to thank our participants. It was a really productive and fun session, and they allowed us to see that there is broad knowledge on protection to people within the context of migration. We really want to thank again for being able to be in this regional conference on migration and to continue supporting them. Thank you to all participants for all your support and enthusiasm in your participation. And we think, yeah, we lost him, it appears. Yeah, we lost him. Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah, okay. So, Gustavo, if any of our colleagues in the course would like to ask a question, or like to go more in depth, the ideal is to give them the floor and then we can retake for closing. We have a very specific question. Can we have the presentation?
Claro, con mucho gusto. Vamos a
Sure.
pasarlo a la Secretaría Ejecutiva para que les haga
We
llegar
are
los
going to
documentos con
submit it
mucho
to the
gusto.
executive secretary so they can disseminate it. And also, if you can place it in the chat or we can distribute later.
Claro, con mucho gusto.
Your
Gracias.
choice.
Ya lo vamos a postear.
Okay. We have many comments that was great learning and dynamic one. Juan, our winner has a comment.
Bueno, antes que nada, muchas gracias a Roslyn y a los
Before
compañeros y compañeras.
everything,
Creo que el curso ha sido
thank you,
excelente,
Rosalind,
muy
Olga,
interactivo. Sin
Catalina,
duda,
and
una
everybody.
forma,
This is more of a question of form.
sobre todo para el certificado, tengo algunas dudas.
So, regarding the
Primera,
certificate,
no sé si las
I don't
sesiones,
know
por lo menos que son
whether
virtuales,
the sessions that are virtual,
alguien
we
externo,
are
porque
going
ya
to
hemos
have anybody
compañeros
external
nuestro
to
certificado
have a control, because we already have our certificate
que hemos completado el curso autodirigido.
that we have
Queda mucha
completed
duda
the
de cómo se
self-paced
van a ir
course.
haciendo como
I wanted to know how
del control y todo eso.
these control
caso,
will
yo
be
me registré
handled.
en la plataforma
I registered in eCampus with my alternate email,
las sesiones de esta
and in
presentación
these
compartirlas en nuestra red.
presentations,
Y
I have my
otra pregunta para la
institution's
certificación, ¿no?
email address. So I want to know how the certification would flow then. The self-paced course, you are going to have the certificate if you completed it. And for these sessions, especially today and tomorrow, which is through the executive secretariat, we're going to have the registration, a roll call for attendance, and we're going to give you a participation certificate that is going to be sent to you. They have questions on how to upload the certificate. So if you could tell us.
Claro, con mucho gusto.
Yeah, sure.
Vamos a dejar aquí el correo
We
nuevamente
are going
de
to
eCampus
leave
para que por favor
the
dirijan ahí
eCampus
que tengan en cuanto al
email.
uso de la plataforma.
So you have any consultations regarding the use of the platform.
Una consulta de Dalia
Here
y
you have a question from Dalia,
para donde tienen que subir el
and
certificado.
where you have to, for example, upload the certificate.
Curso
We have a
autodirigido,
certificate
que es el que
on
actualmente
finalizing or completing
estamos ahora
the
trabajando con
auto or
nosotros,
self-paced
determinantes de
course
vulnerabilidad de OIM.
on determining factors
Hay un
for
certificado
vulnerability.
que se va a dar a
But we
todas las
also
personas
have
que
a
llevaron
certificate
las
that
sesiones
is going to
virtuales y que
be
también
for
finalizaron ese
all
curso
those
participativo. Entonces, voy a dejar aquí
who
nuevamente el
finish
correo
not
de
only
Campus
these virtual sessions, but
para que por
also the
favor
course.
puedan escribir ahí cualquier duda que
So you
tengan y
can
les orientamos con muchísimo gusto.
write about any questions. I'm going to give you the eCampus email. And remember that the June 18th session is also in our YouTube channel. And that link will also be posted. And Ana Catalina also included their presentation in the chat, so you can download it. Also, Luis, that the eCampus platform, we also have the videos and sessions that we had the 18th, and we're going to have today's and tomorrow's. So those who have attended these sessions will also find the previous sessions in the channel of the regional conference and the eCampus platform. And for assistance today and tomorrow, please register yourselves individually. Some people share other links. So if possible, try
to register ourselves individually. Any other questions or comments? If we don't have any comments, we really want to thank Rose and Catalina. We wish these activities were more often, more frequent. And you have the floor back again, Gustav. Or Klingsman, would you like to say something? We have and we have a, I did not hear that well. The posting can be after the third session. This includes also you need you should complete it tomorrow, like the assessment. I would also like to say that we have the registration guideline. If you have had trouble to register in eCampus, and the email for you to address or ask for any help if needed. Yes, you have your mic closed. Gustavo, you have the floor. So before closing, question, Juliana. Tomorrow we finish the virtual sessions for our colleagues of the other member countries. How much time before closing the course, including the post-text, so everybody can get their certificate? And the one that you get automatically and the one that you get from the executive secretary. What or how much time are we talking about for people to take the course and take into account to get one or both certificates? So we could leave the space open to Monday, July 5th, so everybody can finish the self-paced course. At the end of the day, on Monday, we could close it. The self-paced course will not take more than 3 hours. It's quite user-friendly. If you liked what you saw today and you have not taken the course, we tell you that you should take it. We have a great opportunity, so we really invite you to make the most out of it. Thank you, Juliana, Luis Alonso, Rosen, Ana Catalina. Thank you so much for your participation, everybody, for your for the ability of keeping us engaged. You have this facility, this capability. And we want to also thank all members of the RCM, all the different officers, personnel, civil society that is part of this conversation that we've had for 2 sessions already on the 18th and today. And of course, those who have progressed with the self-paced course. I think today has been a great opportunity for those who took the course to reinforce what they already had, and those who are with the activities to do it with more detail and to confirm all the different elements that we have in the platform. Also to tell you that this is the second session that we have as part of the activity tomorrow we are going to have an activity that is vitally important, and the idea is to present before the member countries and institutions the regional guidelines, a very important document for all first line personnel first, and to build public policies regarding assistance to migrants in all the sessions and working groups, and in particular with the activities that we've had in the regular mass migration working group, we have a constant. And Luis Alonso, who has been participating in all the meetings, can tell me if I'm mistaken or keep me honest. We have one element. We need regional frameworks. We need to generate regional strategies to provide assistance to migrants. And exercises such as today, documents such as the one presented today, self-paced courses as the ones that we have in the platform, and documents that have already been approved by this RCM for about a decade now, and which we are updating and reapproving this new, for example, document that could be framework for public policy in the region, are extremely important. So we invite everybody to be with us tomorrow in this session, to thank you again on behalf of the Mexican PPT, on behalf of Alejandra Sina, Subsecretary of Human Rights Population, uh, for your assistance to this activity. And we reiterate our interest and effort to continue generating these capacities, abilities, and strategies to provide assistance to migrants. And from Mexico, in this regional conference and this particular forum, we wish to continue driving regional strategies. With so we have contributed a bit more to this big edifice that will be regional strategies to assist migrants in irregular status. Thank you, colleagues of the RCM IM and colleagues. And remember, tomorrow at 10 a.m. Mexico time, we will be holding the third session, and the officers of the member countries should attend, so you know the document and the dynamic on how the process will be carried out to approve this document. This is again an effort from the PPT of Costa Rica and that of Mexico, and to contribute for the next PPT of 2022, what we called our Troika, the three PPTs working together and in agreement with the strategic plan. Thank you all. Thank you all. See you tomorrow, same link that you used today, okay? So see you tomorrow.